your head and looking at your time. Oh, okay. You just slip it. Part of the clip works.
We will wait just another second until these microphones get fixed.
Should I? If necessary.
There are some of us who still use typewriters.
Quite an interesting amphitheater. It is. How many people?
Maybe I'll get going. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this panel discussion. We'll be focusing tonight on the press, on politics, and on a president's health or a presidential candidate's health. And we could ask the question right up front, is there a proper balance that can be struck, if a balance is to be struck at all, between a candidate's right to privacy concerning his or her medical records and the public's right to know? And in this current political environment, everybody seems to want to know everything. Well, I'm Marvin Kalb, director of the Shorenstein-Barone Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School, and the co-sponsor of tonight's forum event is the Dean of the Harvard Medical School, Dr. Daniel Costason. With some words of introduction and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Marvin. Well, it's a pleasure for me as Dean of the Faculty of Medicine to welcome all of you to this forum on presidential health, the press, and politics. You will hear, and we will have a chance to think together during the next hour and a half about the conflicts between the need, I think I like need a little better than right, of people to know about the health of the president and presidential candidates, the need of individuals, even presidents, for some measure of privacy, particularly in relation to their own personal health, and the need of physicians to honor their ancient obligation to treat information which they glean from their patients as privileged. These issues are hardly new, and I thought I would begin our deliberations by reading to you briefly the remarkable story of President Grover Cleveland's cancer. In 1893, he developed oral cancer, and as described by Philip Marshall Dale in his volume on medical biographies, the following story ensued. The growth was the size of $0.25 and extended from the bicuspid teeth on the left to within 1/3 of an inch of the soft palate. It was found to have invaded the overlying bone of the upper jaw. Mr. Cleveland instructed Surgeon Joseph D. Bryant to go ahead with necessary preparations, but enjoined the greatest secrecy on the part of all concerned. The doctors arranged to use the yacht Oneida for the surgery of, quote, our friend, unquote, as the vessel steamed slowly up New York City's East River. On the team were a Dr. Hasbrook, a dentist, and a surgeon, W.W. Keene, and others. Mr. Cleveland was propped up in a chair against the ship's mast, and administration of the anesthetic was begun. It began with nitrous oxide, and once he was unconscious, switched to ether. Satisfactory anesthesia was obtained only after some difficulty. Dr. Hasbrook then extracted the two left upper bicuspid teeth, following which Dr. Bryant began excision of the growth. He worked rapidly and with great skill, and in 31 minutes after its beginning, the operation was completed. Most of the left upper jaw was removed, but the orbital plate was left intact, nor was external incision necessary. With the fitting of a prosthesis, the contour of the face and the characteristic features would be restored. Cleveland's mouth healed, and a rubber prosthesis left his appearance as well as his voice essentially unchanged. For 2 months, there was not so much as a rumor. Then a Philadelphia newspaper carried a complete, accurate account of the operation, described the secrecy surrounding it, a story allegedly leaked by the dentist. By then, however, the president was back on his feet and in apparent good health, and few believed the article. He lived 15 more years. Not until 1928 was it finally confirmed by a participant, Dr. Keene, to be true. I am delighted at the panel of experts who have been gathered to think about these issues, and look forward to hearing how you would have dealt with this and other cases, many of which have occurred since 1893. Welcome all.
I note that the president at that time did not have to worry about television or 6:30 deadlines, which would have made things a bit more difficult for him to conceal that operation. And in any case, recent American history is fairly rich with other examples. In doing the research for tonight, I came upon the illustration in 1944 of President Roosevelt's doctor telling the press, and through the press, the American people, that the president was in certainly good enough shape to run for a 4th time. He was not, and he died the following year. And in 1961, President Kennedy's doctor, aware of stories that the president had Addison's disease, told reporters that he had a mild adrenal deficiency. And last year, there were many rumors at the beginning of last year, after President Bush got sick in Tokyo, that he was really very sick, and there were mysterious stories about ailments of one sort or another, never confirmed. And of course, the most famous story last year concerning the press and the issue of a presidential candidate's health concerned former Senator Paul Tsongas's episode of recurring cancer. Now, with specific respect to Tsongas, there are questions that immediately arise. I mean, was this presidential candidate leveling fully with the American public on a matter of extraordinarily important public policy? Were his doctors leveling with the American public? Were his doctors somehow or another putting themselves in the position of spokesmen in a political cause rather than doctors dealing with a confidential medical problem? And did the candidate and his doctors both have a higher ethical and social responsibility to the American public? Our panel tonight to handle these and many other questions is large and illustrious, and starting on my left will be 2 members of the press. David Shribman, the Washington bureau chief of the Boston Globe, who's going to be slipping out at 7:15, by the way, just to catch a flight. Dr. Timothy Johnson, the medical editor of ABC News. Cecil Labach, an ethicist and a writer and a fellow at the Shorenstein Barone Center this semester. And to my right, Frederick Schauer, the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment, a member of the faculty of the Kennedy School. Dr. Alan Brandt, a professor of the history of medicine at the Harvard Medical School. Dr. Glenn Steele, chair of the Department of Surgery at Deaconess Hospital. And Dr. Edwin Kassem, chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Mass General Hospital. Let me ask all of you to answer the first question in no more than 3 minutes, if you can do that. And if you come in under 3, you'll have my gratitude, because we have a lot of things to cover. So, right up front, does a presidential candidate have a right to privacy? In this case, I'm talking about right, not need, but a right to privacy regarding his or her medical history. If so, how much? Does everything have to be revealed, or can part of it be revealed? And on the other side, what is the public's need or right to know these issues, in part or in whole? And why don't we start with Dave Shrivnan?
This panel must be a great spectacle for all of you to have the Boston Globe reporter at the far right of any group. But nonetheless,
My left.
your left. Nonetheless, I think from my point of view, and I think from a point of view of the way our government operates, yes, a man or woman has a right to privacy, but the person who feels strongly about that right to personal privacy and medical privacy probably could be a taxi cab driver or an insurance adjuster or even the dean of the Harvard Medical School, but he probably shouldn't run for president. You have a right to privacy, but you also, no one is making you run for president. And when you run for president, I think one of the things you do is you cede much of that right to privacy. I was reading on the way up an account, not of 1944, Marvin, but of 1940, when President Roosevelt was contemplating the enormous symbolic and political question about whether to seek a third term. And he chose as his running, after he decided to do so, he chose as his running mate Henry Wallace, whom he probably wouldn't have chosen in any other context except for the fact that he felt he needed someone who looked healthy, and because he was worried that he wasn't healthy himself. And so health questions mold political choices like that. Henry Wallace would probably have been nobody's choice for vice president save Henry Wallace's. And he really wanted to be president anyhow. So I think that's just a small vignette and a small example of how health questions do mold and shape political questions. And I don't think there's anything that we in the press, and by I say we in the press, I mean we in the public, ought not to know about someone's health. And that's why I suspect Marvin called on me first, so I would take the most outre view.
Thank you. Tim Johnson?
I basically agree with that, but I would want to filter that information, I think, through some kind of a panel of experts. Now, as Ross Perot is fond of saying, the devil is in the details, and I don't know that I have the right details in spelling out that process. But I too feel that when it comes to the presidential candidate or the president, unlike any other level of government, we have a right to know, or at least have filtered knowledge for us, everything about the president. Now, just by way of example, 3 levels of kinds of examples. When I think it comes to traditional physical problems, that would be relatively easy to convey to the public and put in perspective. But what about emotional conditions that might be in that person's history, just to lay that on the table? A person, for example, who had been treated for a severe depression 15 years earlier with medication for 8 months, had been tapered off that medication and had done fine since. Would that information be important for the public to know? Or in a social history that might be semi-routine for many physicians or in many medical records. What if a given candidate had had a period of sexual promiscuity 10 years ago? No evidence of any resulting physical disability. Would that be important information for the public to know in this day and age of AIDS? I would think that it might be possible for some kind of panel of experts to be appointed with the blessing of both the Republican and Democratic National Committees from a distinguished group of physicians, identified in many possible ways, to sift through all of the records for a candidate and convey to the public anything that might be detrimentally to the potential performance of that candidate, without having to reveal in stark form everything that was in all of the records. That's the kind of process that I would like to see considered.
Sister LeBuck?
Yes, I'd like to go a little further with this balancing process between privacy and the public's right to know. On the one hand, we have certainly undergone quite a learning process in this century. We've heard about a number of the cases, and even most recently in this past election, I think we have to take very seriously the anguish that Senator Tsongas must feel now in retrospect, in looking back at the campaign and in thinking what might have been. And I think we must also take very seriously his proposal that there should be some kind of process. I think we should start now thinking about a process before the next election so that this kind of thing won't happen again. The public does have a right to know everything about a candidate's health that bears in any way on the way in which the candidate as president might carry out his or her duties. On the other hand, now I want to go to the side of privacy. I would not go so far at all as to say that everything about a person's health has to be known by the public and by the press. I think that in that case we would come very close to a kind of reversal of 1984, the novel, Orwell's novel. As you may remember, in that novel we saw Winston Smith, who was cowering in his apartment, and there were all kinds of ways in which the government, Big Brother, could spy on him. Well, I very much hope that presidential candidates and presidents themselves can keep a little more privacy than that. For instance, to take an example, let's say that a president cannot conceive babies, if that is still possible. Let us say that a president much older has spells of incontinence. I don't see any reason why the public should know any of that. There are various other very private matters that some candidates might want to reveal, and in that case it should be perfectly all right, but that nobody ought to have to reveal. And there are two reasons for that. First of all, if we deprive a person altogether of privacy, then that person can become like something of a hunted animal. And I think it is dehumanizing to have no corner of your life that is completely and entirely your own. Secondly, if we deprive a person of the possibility of privacy as soon as that person consults a physician, then naturally this candidate, or later on perhaps president, isn't going to go to a doctor with some things that might potentially be very important. So I think we want to be very careful not to place this extra burden on candidates and on presidents. It's already very, very demanding to run for such an office. We don't want to make it impossible. So I think we have to stick up also for the privacy of candidates and of presidents once they're elected, but at the same time make absolutely sure, and I think some kind of panel or commission might be a good idea, make absolutely sure that candidates from now on do reveal their medical histories and reveal anything that could bear on how they might carry out the office of president.
Thank you very much, Cicely. Brett Schauer.
I think this may be one of numerous areas in which people expect the law to do far more work than it can or far more work than it should. Let me start with two simple legal propositions about legal rights. One, it seems quite clear to me that should a member of the press by hook or by crook come across the medical records of a public official or candidate for high public office, there would be no way of preventing publication in advance, the lesson of the Pentagon Papers, nor would there be any plausible claim by the candidate against the member of the press. Our conception of a right to privacy in a legal right sense clearly ends with the legal term is the idea of newsworthiness. On the other side, it is equally clear from an equally long line of cases that should, under current law, a candidate for high public office choose to keep her or his medical records or medical history secret, there is no way that under current law the judicial system or the law could be used to force disclosure. Now that those technical aspects of the law have been put aside, let's talk about a couple of things that might be of more substance or interest. Here I want to come down on the side of the dean in suggesting that we can think better about this issue if we minimize our use of the word rights. Very often, rights occupy, or rights discourse occupies a place in public discourse that is roughly the equivalent of yelling even more loudly. It may be that a right is the conclusion that we want to put to what we decide at the end of this or similar debates. Let's not load the debate at the beginning by suggesting an excess use for rights at the beginning. If we are talking just therefore about a competing range of needs, or I would want to say interests, we might mention briefly three of them. One, the obvious one, a public interest in a democratic society in knowing about the qualifications, abilities, and all sorts of other details about its officials and about its candidates. Second, the public interest as a matter of democratic theory in having the public, rather than either the candidates or the press, decide what's relevant to the act of casting a vote. This was an issue that was quite important in thinking about a number of privacy-related issues about sexual conduct and the like in the preceding election. It may be an issue that related to Senator Eagleton and electroshock therapy. It is one thing for people like us to say it's irrelevant, but it may be, as a matter of democratic theory, that if the public decides it's relevant, even though people like us think it's irrelevant, there are difficult issues about either the press or others interposing themselves as filters, saying, we don't think that what you think is relevant to the exercise of your electoral decision is relevant to making that decision. And finally, the other side of this complex range of interests is, to put a slightly different twist on it, a public official, especially a president or presidential candidate's interest in getting good, frank advice. Here, the constitutional law on this issue was established by then President Nixon in the issue of executive privilege. The claim is, if there is disclosure of a certain range of confidential advice kinds of conversations and the like, does it prevent a president from getting the kind of advice that enables the president to do the president's job most effectively? I have a great interest and even a great need, I think, to know what the President of the United States right now thinks about policy about Haiti, Haitians, and immigration. I would love to know the content of his discussions with Secretary of State Christopher about all of this. But if those conversations were available to the public, the president could not get the kind of advice that the president needs. So on the other side, there is, and this is especially relevant to the psychological, psychiatric side of this issue, if there is a process that prevents a president from getting frank medical, psychological, psychiatric advice, will that interfere with the president's ability to do the job of president?
Thank you, Fred. Alan Brandt?
Thank you. This issue really brings together two very significant trends in American social and cultural life, as well as political life of the 20th century. One, I would suggest, is the respect that we have as a society for privacy. And within the constitutional law, we've seen, in fact, an increase in respect in certain ways for the rights of privacy. Many people have argued that privacy is actually the critical bedrock on which any medical relationship really rests. So we continue to hear, even if there have been deteriorations in respect for medical confidentiality in the course of the 20th century, tremendous respect for the idea that medicine really can't take place without privacy and without confidentiality. On the other hand, of course, within our political process, we've seen an enormous turn in the course of the 20th century towards a tremendous value on disclosure and honesty, even though we recognize that very often those principles haven't guided political practice. So in fact, we see these two very powerful trends in American culture coming into conflict around this particular issue, and I think that's what makes it so fundamentally difficult. But there's one third issue that I think is clear, and I think there's a great deal of consensus actually among people looking at this issue, that the public does have an interest in the health of its president, in the health of its leaders. But the question then becomes, what are the processes, what are the mechanisms by which that information gets to the public, and then how is it understood? And I think we'll see a lot of recommendations in the months and years ahead to say, well, let's let a medical panel decide. And that's really a third trend in the course of 20th century science and politics, the trend to say medical authority can in fact solve this problem. And I'd like to suggest that that may be especially difficult. There seems to be an assumption in many of the discussions about the public and its need to know medical data, that medical data is clear, it's objective, it's scientific, and once put out, we all will understand it in the same way. But in fact, we know, and I'm sure my medical colleagues who will speak in a moment will attest, that the kinds of data and the kinds of information that in fact we may have an interest in knowing are enormously complex, ambiguous, negotiated, typically within intimate relations between patients and doctors, and therefore in the public realm may take on fundamentally different meanings. And I think from a historical perspective, it's worth noting that some of the presidents who we may look back over the historical record with a great deal of respect for what they accomplished and what they did, in our current political context, might have been politically incapacitated from actually serving and from accomplishing some of the things that we would respect. So in that sense, I think that's an important caution. My last point is really this, is that politics and medicine may be much more alike than we would want to admit.
Thank you very much. Dr. Steele.
Well, first of all, Dan, I assume that your anecdote is not your own personal paradigm of how we should end this discussion. Secondly, what I think I can bring to the table, since I'm not an expert in any of the areas that preceded me, is a little bit of connection to what it's like to actually take care of a patient, and specifically what it's like to take care of patients with significant illnesses, because that's what I do. And I believe that actually in my relationship to my patients, that probably the most effective therapeutic catalyst is not the technical or non-surgical medical aspects, but trust. Most of my patients end up dying, and we have small victories along the way, and generally we ultimately lose. But the gratification that comes in relating to a patient as a doctor, particularly in the kind of environment that we're talking about in Boston, is not winning or losing necessarily, but how the relationship is carried on. And that is almost exclusively based on trust. And therefore, as far as my own ethical standards are concerned in relating to these extraordinarily important questions, I believe that a doctor's relationship to his patient should be based on minimizing, however one can, any conflicts. And I think that the relationship is extraordinarily complex enough without having to be a spokesman, without having to interpret data, without having to do things that are beyond giving the patient as much truth as one possibly can, so that that patient can make his or her informed decision. Now, I think that truth is an ethical imperative, and I think it's a good tactic as well. And I would suggest that in answering Marvin's question, my tendency would be to come down fairly dramatically on getting as much of the truth out as quickly as possible, because it's going to come out anyway. And I frankly think that part of the political process here is based on the intelligence of the electorate. I think that by and large, decisions that are wrong are corrected. And I think that the most reasonable decisions can be made on the basis of a complete and detailed truth, certainly on the basis of the patient and on the basis of the electorate. I do not, however, think that it would be very easy for the doctor to be both the physician to the patient and a spokesman at the same time, outside of that relationship.
Thank you very much. Dr. Casson, please.
Well, I was initially alarmed when David said that he from the Globe was on the far right, that I, born and bred in Nebraska, would end up on the far left. But I realized that from my point of view, it's the far right, so I feel much better after that. Now, United Airlines and the Boston Patriots demand a physical examination before a pilot can fly or a professional athlete can play. But there is no such requirement for the president that he pass a physical or she pass a physical examination. And in thinking about this balance between public and private, I was thinking about the problem in psychiatry raised by the Tarasoff decision, where a psychiatrist has a duty to warn when the patient is dangerous. So that Tarasoff case came up because a young man on a campus in California, University of California, told the counselor he wanted to kill one of the women's students. But the counselor told the security but did not tell the young woman. That boy went out and killed her. And the case came up, and from that time on, the psychiatrist has a duty to warn about dangerousness. So remember, and it is to protect the victim. So the duty is to protect the victim. So if we follow through that, there are three phases that the physician has, three oblique parts of it. First is to assess dangerousness. And so one gathers the data, what's the evidence for it, and then makes a determination, is this dangerousness? The second one is one must choose a course of action then to protect the threatened person. And then the third thing is you have to do it. You have to do that. Now in the application, if it's similar to places where the victims are not identifiable. So when the victims are not identified, this would be the public who would be perhaps would be endangered by a president or harmed by the president. So then one works on the patient if they're dangerous. You have to take them out of circulation. So here, I feel that it is the president's moral obligation, if the president is unfit, to reveal that and drop out of the race, so that the doctor's duty would be thinking first how to block the candidacy of that. If this was a candidate, or if the president was disabled, how to act in that way. And I think that's complex in that. Remember, there was a famous saying that came out of that Tarasov rule, quote, "Protective privilege ends where public peril begins." That was a famous phrase. It's worth thinking about. Now, the fourth step they didn't talk about, and that's Kassim's perverse rule, which is whatever the doctor does, the doctor should never, 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 ever talk to the press. I'm sorry, Tim, David, Marvin. Now, the reason that I say that is I feel my duty is to notify a responsible person. And the press is not disinterested. That is, they sell the information. They are paid for the information by selling the newspapers or by the Nielsen ratings or whatever. And so I feel that puts the patient then in double jeopardy. Besides, I think there's a double standard. For instance, if a presidential candidate had gonorrhea, then that would be sensational news. However, if a current president had gonorrhea, probably everybody would think, well, we better treat this. I mean, and there'd be much less eagerness, because the market for information that comes through the media is the prurient interests of the public. And that's my third concern about the doctor, sorry, Tim, the doctor talking to the press, and that is there's public cruelty that is exercised towards certain persons. First of all, those who are disabled. So to reveal the disability of a person, as Professor Bach said, could be disabling. If you were to reveal that, say incontinence, or if you were to think that the presidential candidate, even Thomas Jefferson, had Peyronie's disease, which that means that the penis is bent, all right? So suppose that person would be subjected to jokes from the minute, and unceasingly from the minute that was revealed. And the final one is that the public is exceedingly cruel with regard to emotional problems, has actually a major obstacle in understanding that. And my thought would be, well, this might be an opportunity for them to be educated. However, the sensational news appears on page 1, and the president is defective, and on page 79, a few days later, in small print, and this is what a mental illness is like, and so on. So those are my concerns about this question.
Dr. Kassim, if I heard you right at the beginning of your comments, you seem to be saying that there ought to be a requirement on the part of a presidential candidate that his or her medical record is made public. Is that correct?
No, well, I think that's outrageous, actually. William Osler said, just as the patient has no right to every medicine in my bag, they have no right to every thought in my head. And for the public to have the right to every single bit of information in the person's medical record seems to me to be outrageous.
No, but I wasn't asking that. I was asking whether you felt it ought to be a requirement that a medical examination
I think
be
it's very,
taken by all of the candidates.
very reasonable to
How
pass it.
is the information then going to be passed on to the public, or do you think it should not be passed on to the public?
No, the public is going to be very curious about that. Any doctor who...
How does it get passed on?
That's, I was hoping you'd answer that. We've
I-
heard about a committee, that would be set up, bipartisan, or actually, it'd be nice, I would say, well, why don't you draw up some standards that you think that the president should meet in order to pass a physical examination, and not perhaps worry about all the little sordid details that might come out. That might be a fair request.
Well, a number of people on the panel have already said this evening that there ought to be, Tim Johnson spoke about a filter. Cecil LeBach agreed with the idea of a commission of some sort, a medical commission that might look into the matter of presidential health. David Shribman, from your point of view in Washington, as a journalist, as a bureau chief, how would you see this evolve? What, in a practical way, would have to happen? Do we need legislation? Do we need a constitutional amendment?
Well, I suspect you won't get either a constitutional amendment or legislation. I think you might get something, and this is, of course, the great opportunity, at the same time the great danger, like the Presidential Commission on Debates, which would be kind of a bipartisan thing and would have its own kind of purview. But the danger is that the Bipartisan Commission on Debates itself became political in this last election, and there were debates about whether there should be debates and who would run these debates, and it becomes absurd. And the danger of this subject is that you do reduce a lot of this to absurdity. You can think of questions about, bent genitalia, and I thought of one just sitting here. Could you elect someone president if he was flatulent? Maybe he couldn't have a summit with Yeltsin. Or someone who had any kinds of problems. It would be, but the question isn't in the extremes. We have to deal with, with some very fundamental, everyday kinds of questions about people's health and about people's mental stability. And there's a lot to be said about somebody's private rights, but I think if we're worried also about the public well-being, that no one, again, as I say, no one forces one to run for this office. And whether it's through a panel, which I suspect is a good idea, as long as there's some representative who has some interest in this, whose inclination is towards dissemination rather than towards obfuscation, which some of these panels and some of our panelists might be more inclined to be. That I would be able to accept that, but we have to remember that we're talking about the public's rights. There's no longer a Cold War, and there's no longer the danger of nuclear holocaust. So the argument about somebody's mental stability and fingers on the button are less compelling. But there are other questions that I think are equally compelling, and I'm concerned that the public's interest would be ill-served if we didn't address this frontally, and that if we took pains to create a commission that itself got involved in a whole bunch of political issues, we'd be having some trouble.
Tim Johnson, did you want to comment on that?
Well, I'm a little more optimistic about the ability of a panel to function if it were chartered from the start as an independent body, maybe like the Federal Reserve
So we're not
Board.
talking now about the need for any legislation, any constitutional changes to the 25th Amendment. You think it could happen as a result of what specifically occurring?
I think if, as I said, the two major parties agreed on a process that would set up an independent commission that they would approve, but once approved would function independently, that competent physicians could sort out these kind of conundrums we've been raising 999 out of 1,000 times in terms of what should be conveyed to the public. I'm really quite optimistic about that. Let me cite back the examples I brought up at the beginning. I didn't mean to bring them up for this purpose, but just quickly, in the case of the Tsongas case, I think it's clear it should have been revealed. And in retrospect, I think everybody involved agrees with that. What about the Depression 15 years ago? But no recurrence, functioning fine since. I think a panel would look at that and say no need to reveal that to the public. And similarly with the...
What right, I'm just trying to jump in, forgive me,
Right.
but not as a journalist, but as a citizen. What right does this panel have to decide for me, a citizen,
That's right.
what I should know about the person I'm going to elect president of the United States?
Because I think their charge is to assess current ability to function in light of past risk. They can recognize that the public has a pejorative attitude, as Ned rightly says, I think, toward emotional illness and weigh that in the balance. But if in their expertise that episode 15 years ago has no bearing on current ability to function, I would think it would not have to be revealed. And finally, with the example of the sexual promiscuity, they may wish to order some tests to make sure there's been no resulting disease. And if those tests were negative, again, I don't think that would have to be revealed. That's one way of looking at examples.
Look at it from, you talked, Professor Brown, a moment ago about the relationship sometimes of politics to medicine, and they overlap. I'm just trying to think again, realistically, how the process would actually work. Could you come upon a realistic scenario that Tim has just attempted to lay out, where somebody had a serious psychological, psychiatric, I'm not sure of the distinction sometimes, problem 15 years ago? Would you want to know about that?
Well, I think that people would want to know, and that's why I think that the idea of making this an explicitly medical judgment in which you can clearly parse out what people would say, well, this is appropriate to let the public know, and this isn't, is enormously complex. And the fact is, if we had subjected our recent presidents to mental status exams, many would have probably been disqualified. I mean, seriously, if you look at the recent biographies of Johnson and Nixon, for example, there have been very serious allegations in the historical literature that at various moments in time during their presidencies, they were seriously emotionally unstable. So I'm not saying one way or another, realistically, that anyone would have been disqualified on the basis of these kinds of examinations, but it's an enormously complex process. And this is where I think health really enters the political realm. People are making political judgments. A commission like that would really be, in a sense, a political entity.
Yes, it would.
And it's a very complicated issue. I was just thinking, for example, what if we got a list of all the medications that presidential candidates were taking? Now, we all know how complex medications are, and my guess is that probably many of the current candidates take medications. Now, all medications have some side effects, and those side effects, even though small in percentages, such as disorientation, dizziness, not to take alcohol when you're taking it, are small risks that are generally gauged by physicians to be worth taking for the benefit of the medication. But one can imagine, and I think this is what makes it complicated. I don't think this makes it, clear what we should do. But you can imagine if in the press, every candidate's list of medications were run down, and then the speculation, well, I noticed last Thursday during that press conference, President Reagan seemed a little disoriented. Was this a result of the aging process? Was this a result of the complex polypharmacy that he currently gets? And in other words, I don't think it's going to be a simple issue to sort of say, we'll have medical experts lay this out for us in a clear way that we can then attest an individual is prepared to hold the office.
Well, let me ask Doctors Steele and Kassim, if, because they both spoke so forcefully about their view that they would not be spokesmen for a presidential candidate. They are physicians. They will deal on a confidential basis. Could you see yourself at the same time being members of Tim Johnson's panel of doctors, looking into and then judging the competence of a person to be president?
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible. There are a lot of nuances, and I actually would prefer having a candidate agree to opening his records, frankly. And if there was a consensus that an impartial panel of credible individuals, who probably would be a standing panel, that is, not just a temporary appointment process, Obviously, I would not comment on any patient that I had anything to do with as a physician. I mean, I think that's the important point there.
Okay, so you don't feel, the distinction that you're making is you don't talk about your own patients, but you could talk about other doctors.
I could certainly give ranges. If someone asked me, what is the prognosis of this patient? He's had a cancer, it's been cured, it's a certain stage, what is the prognosis? I could very easily look at the record, interpret the record, and give a range of prognosis.
Dr. Cassidy, your own view on that?
Well, I think, again, my primary relationship is to the patient, so what I'm going to say to the patient is, I don't talk to anybody about your illness. And then if the patient said, well, you understand me the best of anybody, I would like you to talk about it. So then I'd say, well, the first hazard is I'd have to tell the truth. I don't understand. I'm not going to obfuscate the questions. Somebody asked me a question about you, I would have to tell them exactly the way I understood it.
So that although you said before you would never talk to the press,
right?
But if your patient who's running for president wants you to talk to the press, you'd assume that role?
I'm not sure that I would. I would tell them that I would.
You seem to be saying no.
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't. In fact, there have been examples coming up from time to time, not with presidential candidates, but with extraordinarily people with extraordinary responsibilities, either administratively or in business. And my own personal choice is that if I move outside of my role as a physician, it is potentially compromising to the kind of care and the kind of relationship I have with the patient.
Marvin, if I speak, I'll be selectively quoted.
Okay. Brett Jones.
We started this discussion, again, I think perhaps a little bit too much on the law side, even this immediate one. I think we can put aside totally the possibility of a constitutional amendment. It wouldn't happen. We will not have a constitutional amendment without the concurrence of 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the state legislatures. We all know how difficult a barrier that is. Any issue that generates this amount of disagreement is not going to pass that hurdle. So as a purely practical matter, that's off the table. It's probably equally unlikely that there would be legislation, partly because of the same political considerations, partly because the legislation conceivably, if put in terms of a requirement to run for office above and beyond the requirements stated in the Constitution, might itself be unconstitutional, and that would be problematic. You mentioned the 25th Amendment, however. I might just bring it into the discussion. The 25th Amendment does not deal with candidates, it deals with sitting presidents. The 25th Amendment, providing for presidential disability and succession, is quite long. Just as Hugo Black used to walk around literally with a GPO constitution exactly like this. When someone asked him about free speech or free press, he would say, it's all in here. He would take it out, quote the First Amendment, and that would be the end of the discussion. The 25th Amendment is much longer, much more complex. I am not going to do that. It is interesting to note, however, in this context, that in providing for the procedures for, let us call it, involuntary disability of the president, that is, when the president does not imagine that he or she is disabled, there is a procedure that can be instituted by the vice president and either a majority of the executive officers or such other body as Congress may by law provide. The 25th Amendment seems to imagine that there could be such a commission for purposes of removing a president in cases of disability. This language is clear enough that there's no doubt that were such a body established, it would be upheld by the courts if they touched it at all. And we can at least think about the possibility of that operating on a voluntary basis in another area. And I'll finish now just by noting there is now a developing norm of disclosure of tax returns without the encouragement or forcing of legislation or constitutional amendments, the development of norms of candidate behavior, and this is a good example, tends to come generally neither from constitutional amendment nor from legislation. It may be useful to think of this conversation not as one that would generate laws, but maybe one that would generate or not generate the possibility of the kind of social pressures that have produced social pressures about tax returns.
Yes, if I could say something along the same lines here, it seems to me that we now have 2 years perhaps, or at least 1 year before the next campaign begins. We do have the time, first of all, to think about the criteria for the kinds of questions that should definitely be out in the public arena. Secondly, for thinking of the development of this kind of norm and the kinds of questions we would like to ask of candidates next time. And we very much hope that the press will be even more pressing, in fact, about asking those questions. And then it could very well happen that some candidate might say, well, I'm sorry, I just don't want to talk about my medical record, and that would be something for the public to ponder in the primaries and everything else. And that's not going to go very far this time, partly because of the experiences we've had. So I think we're in pretty good shape if we take seriously the fact that now we are at a position where we can begin to think about criteria, methods, panels, whatever, and be prepared next time.
David?
I think we have to ask all these questions about presidential candidates' health and about president's health, etc. But I think that the guiding assumption ought not to be that the public is foolish or capricious or willing to make jokes or this kind of stuff. You know, we just elected a president and a vice president, both of whom who have not only admitted publicly as if it were some kind of a crime, which it is not, but have kind of gloried in the notion that they've both been involved at various times in their life and may even be involved now in family counseling. Now the notion of that, for instance, Lyndon Johnson, who deeply needed family counseling, would have made such an admission had it been true, or had anyone dared even suggest it to him, is unbelievable. It's not possible to contemplate. But both President Clinton and Vice President Gore at various times in their lives, and in order to appeal to, in part, in order to appeal to a generation of people who have grown up with some ease and comfort about counseling, family counseling, psychotherapy, etc., have made this part of their, not only part of an admission, but part of their shtick. You know, one of the, it's not too much to say that Vice President Gore, who I know finds these confines extremely comfortable and pleasant, he's here a lot before he was vice president, actually made a big deal about it at the convention and made it one of the main themes about one of the things he wanted to tell the country about him. So I think the public is a little more mature about these things than they might have been, say, a half a generation or a generation ago. It may not stop Jay Leno and David Letterman from having a few yucks, but nonetheless, both Clinton and Gore had no problem overcoming this so-called debilitating disadvantage, which that Lyndon Johnson might have considered to have been in the last election. So I think the public is a little more sophisticated than we all are eager to give them credit for.
I want to be clear about one point that has been raised already and discussed. Is there anyone on the panel who does not believe that there should be a requirement that the next time we have a presidential campaign, that the candidates level with the American public to the extent that they make their medical records public? I'm talking about a requirement. Now, does anybody not believe in that?
One caution. I guess I would at least want to, I believe in that, but what will that do about what a bunch of presidential wannabes in 1993 are doing about their willingness to seek medical advice that they may need? At least the caution is whether, to use a favorite phrase of the American press, whether there will be a chilling effect on the willingness of people who are going into public life to secure the medical advice that they may need, especially in the area of psychological and psychiatric advice, if their perception is a little bit different from the one we've just heard. And I don't know whether they would have, at least some people, I would guess, would be afraid to get assistance that they might otherwise need. And that's at least the cautionary footnote about even voluntary disclosure.
But even taking that into account, does anyone have strong views against the idea of this kind of medical disclosure?
Are you advocating that they bring all of their hospital records from
Well,
day
now
one
that's my next question.
to the press
Tim.
conference?
No, that's my next question. My next question. Because this can be done obviously in a number of different ways. It has been suggested earlier that a candidate could get a medical examination and the results of that medical examination be made public. Now, then you'd have to say, since we've all gone through medical examinations that were not exactly thorough, what is it that is going to be made public? And that gets to Cicely Bach's point, that there's a spread here. And is everything to be made public, or just some things to be made public? Who decides that? Is that a responsibility of the candidate, or is that a responsibility that the press has to seek out that information? I would think yes, on the latter question anyway. But what about the candidate? The candidate surely would not want something bad or potentially politically damaging to come out. So who then ends up being responsible for this issue? I think we're getting to a point now where the complexity of it
We
becomes
have to
quite
keep
clear.
asking this question, Mara, and we have to keep asking guys who are running,
We being the press.
guys and women who are running for the presidency, we have to keep asking that question. And if they're, you know, and if there's stuff that they're holding back or lying to us, then that's part of the game, and that's part of the price they're going to pay if it comes out, as doctors warned that it inevitably will. I mean, we have to ask the question.
Tim Johnson, you look
Well, no, I would
skeptical.
I would be skeptical about a candidate showing up with all of his hospital records from day one and with reams of material and just passing them out at a press conference, so to speak. That's why I favor a screening process, dispassionate to be sure, and I would hope non-political, but I think it would not make sense to just throw out all this raw data at the press and then to the public.
But the screening process, what I was trying to get at before, is how would that
But everything would be
constituted?
available to the screening process. Nothing would be held back from that.
I see. And this is a group of doctors presumably selected by whom?
Let the National Institute of Medicine appoint a panel. I mean, that's just one quick suggestion. There's a lot of different ways I think one could structure it in a way that would be acceptable.
By the way, this may sound like a crazy question, but it just hit me. Do you have to be a doctor to be given this evidence and make the judgment about whether the person is qualified?
Depends on the expectations of the panel. Basically, if you're trying to establish parameters of survival or effect after 20 years of treatment for depression or what have you, it's probably better to stick to the data. On the other hand, if your expectation for the panel is to make additional judgments, then you'd probably put ethicists and historians and law professors and even maybe a newspaper
Get a
writer.
Bach and a branch.
I won't serve.
I think
Won't serve on that.
I think some sanity has to reign even here, though. Just as with financial disclosure, we don't ask what people earned in pocket money when they were 7 years old, for instance. So with medical records from day one, we don't ask people's birth weight and all the things that happen. There has to be some sanity in all of this. And the sanity has to be connected again with what the public actually needs to know. The public does not need to know how much someone weighed at birth. It may be somewhat interesting. That's one thing. Then there are all kinds of things that I still think that the candidate may simply want to say, these things are private, and I'm willing to stand up and defend anybody's right to keep certain matters private. And again, this is something we can debate beforehand so that no one person has to be stuck. But we could say, for instance, what happens in the bedroom should be private. Or let's say, for instance, that a candidate has had an abortion. Now, that is a very interesting case of
Yes, it is.
the public would love to know about that and might form its, you know, many people in the public would decide the vote on that.
Yes.
Well, some
And
people
yet-
think that's a political choice as much
Yeah,
as a medical
it
choice.
is a political choice.
That's where the two overlap again.
And here, I guess I would like to ask all of you, should we say that the people and the press can ask the candidate, what is your view about abortion, but cannot ask that other question?
Well, you know, that's all well and good, except it's okay to ask, say, a pro-choice woman if she's had an abortion, but it's not okay to ask a so-called pro-life woman if she's had an abortion, because that way you're asking whether she's a hypocrite or not. So, I mean, these are not,
Gets complicated.
these are very, very
But
complicated
candidates are
questions.
asked all the time whether they're hypocrites or not. I mean,
And they answer in a hypocritical fashion. They all say no. Hypocritical answers.
part of what I'm saying is that this kind of information, like all information, once it enters the political process, becomes part of it. And candidates are always trying to restrict information of one form or another, and the press is always aggressively pursuing it. And I think part of what I'm hearing on the panel is that in some measure that works actually pretty well, and that we've actually seen some changes in the norms, the political norms of access to information about candidates. And in light of this past election, those norms are likely to shift towards greater disclosure, perhaps, of medical information, regardless of requirements or legislation or any other type of proposal. And it becomes a political liability. I'm sure Clinton today has to assess on political terms, how much am I paying to withhold my medical record, and how much longer can I continue to withhold it given the scrutiny of the press and the public's interest in it. And so that becomes a political calculation that I think candidates will have to weigh now and in the future.
I think more and more we get into the overlap between the heart of our discussion and just pure old-fashioned politics. By the way, we have another 20 minutes or so to go, and those of you in the audience who would like to ask a question, there are 2 mics right down here on this level, and if you would just go over to the microphone now, I'd be happy to recognize you. And when you ask your question, if you could please identify yourself, and if you'd like to direct the question to somebody on the panel, please do so. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Dr. Franklin Nussbaum. I think if we are really serious about this issue, even beyond discussing it, I can't imagine whose responsibility would be more to know how to put down the guidelines for journalists to ask questions, for the consumer to ask questions, than the medical people themselves. And the scenario that I see is that possibly individual voices who are passionate about this issue will get together and form a little something of their own, and that would spread if we think this is important. I personally think it's most important. All you need is one serious mistake, and then you'll say why. And I think the responsibility is on the medical profession, healthcare profession.
Would anyone, I didn't hear the heart of the question, but would anyone like to respond to the comment? Go ahead.
One of the things I worry about being a newsman for a traditional kind of a general interest newspaper is that most of our reporters don't really know anything about these issues. And that if I got a printout of someone's, whatever they are, hormonal levels and all this kind of stuff, I would have no idea. I mean, I can tell you the rules, what kind of rules you need, what the rules are for winning the Democratic National Convention and how many delegates are available on Super Tuesday, but I can't really tell you anything, frankly, about depression or about gallbladders or about kidneys or even where they are or if they're on the outside or the inside of the body.
Inside.
Right. Which is why people like me need people like you. And that's one of the things we all on our side of this fence have to worry about is that we need to have people evaluating these reports, if and when we do get them, who are somewhat expert in the area. And frankly, to have me or just about anybody in the Washington Bureau of the Boston Globe or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or LA Times evaluate this would be not only hypocritical, but it would be dangerous. And we all need more specialty, more specialists and people with more specialized knowledge to evaluate what's going to be disseminated, oddly enough, to the general public, because frankly, I'm not qualified to do so.
Why does the Boston Globe hire medical specialists?
We do have medical specialists, which is why I wouldn't write this story.
No, but the medical specialist on the Globe could go through the data.
Which is what Larry Altman does for the New York Times quite well, and what you do for ABC, and what others do in other. But we have to be very careful in our end of the business to make sure that we deal with this information in a responsible fashion, and to realize not only how little we know, but the great possibility for catastrophic error on our part.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And doctors, by the way, can make catastrophic errors too. Right there. Yes, please.
I'm Eleanor Shore, a physician, and I want to raise a question about the president who is in office now. First of all, would a responsible, concerned physician take the job of being physician to the president, given the current trends toward request for disclosure? If you thought of the president this evening having chest pain, and there might be a chance that it had an infectious origin, which ought to be treated. It might be myocardial ischemia. If the president's doctor starts out on a full-blown diagnostic trip, there is instantly going to be a request to know about the electrocardiogram and the angiogram and so forth. So the real question is the public's insatiable wish to know going to really perhaps cause trouble with the president's health, because he and his physician are going to be very reluctant to pursue any significant question.
But you know, once a candidate is a president, and therefore is in the White House, that person is in a cocoon. And the people who are outside of the cocoon, even well-informed and plugged-in journalists like Dave Schridman, really don't know exactly what is happening. So that the president's health, that chest pain that night, could be something that is kept within the family. Nobody is going to know about that.
It'd be very hard to go get an angiogram in the White House. It's going to have to be shipped to Bethesda or somewhere, and then there are going to be nurses and anesthetists and so forth.
So your point is that if
in current technology, it's very hard to preserve a cocoon.
Please.
Marvin, actually, a very good point to that is the indication for the colonoscopy on Reagan. As you probably remember, there was some question as to whether the polyp that was found was really premalignant or not. And in general, it's thought not to be premalignant, but there's also no question that political considerations went into his not having of his colon. So I think your point is very well taken. I think the only way of approaching that is somehow, and again, this is the concept of building some sort of an isolation chamber around the duties of the physician for the president. Now, that's somewhat unrealistic, but that's as good as we can do.
Would anyone else like to make
I just had a response to that Dr. Shore brought out really well. I thought, if anybody had chest pain, if somebody in the audience had chest pain, my instant reflex is, something has to be done about it, jump up and go help them. Now, all the rest of it is madness. That is it going to be reported in this way or that way? And because I'm a very limited man, I have this feeling, well, if you're in that important a position, you have to be able to think about it. But I'm not going to. I'm not going to talk about it. You're not going to get it out of my records. My job is pretty well limited. So hopefully you would release me from this burden, which would be to spill all about.
Well, of course, it may be madness, but politics has often been described as a form of madness.
I would just add this word, that it may be a case, again, where we should argue for a separation of the physician treating the president becoming also the spokesperson.
Exactly.
You bet.
And I think that would be
But
one
we
way
all
to
seem
try
to
to
agree
break
at
that
least
down.
on that point.
Yes.
Right? Yes, please.
What you just said addresses part of what I
Could
was
you
going to
identify?
ask. I'm Nancy Sterling. I'm the Director of Community Relations for Mount Auburn Hospital. And I'm wondering, if a president or presidential candidate enters a hospital, how do you balance the patient's right to privacy, which is primary in any hospital, with the notoriety of the person that you have as your patient? And the second part of that is, who should deliver the information about the health of the president or the presidential candidate?
I'd be happy to take Fred.
No, I mean, just especially on this issue, it may be important that we not be president preoccupied. This happens to a lot of public officials. Perhaps because of what I do, the most obvious example for me is Chief Justice Rehnquist's back and the medication about Chief Justice Rehnquist's back, which has been in and out of the news for the past 6 or 7 or 8 years. It may be that in terms of your question, it's especially important to broaden it because the president may be one of the few people among important public officials who can be whisked off to what is essentially a private hospital with major secrecy. Once we are talking about a large number of other public officials, the problems that you raise become much more pressing, although I don't have an answer.
Of course, there's the example only a couple of weeks ago with the Secretary of Defense, Les Aspin. And here, there was a very good illustration of a spokesperson misleading the public about the extent of the Secretary's problem. Indeed, the nature of his treatment only came out later when I think it was the Times actually did a detailed story, and it was discovered that he was given some kind of a shot that cost 88 cents less than another kind of shot that would not have produced the same kind of symptom. So do you say to yourself, the Secretary of Defense, I mean, they're cutting billions of dollars, they can get the 88 cents from somewhere.
May I just add, too, that
Thanks very much.
I had a chance this afternoon to read the guidelines from the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute that have been developed precisely to this kind of question, and they're superb. I think they do an excellent job of delineating step by step how to handle that situation to protect both the patient primarily and the institution. And again, I think it speaks to the fact that if we take the time and effort, we can work these things out.
Another part, if I could attempt an answer to another part of your question, which had to do with who then should speak for the president or the candidate, it has to be kept in a political context, in my opinion. The politician or the spokesperson for the politician may get his or her information from the medical people, but the medical people should not be in a position of being the spokespeople for a candidate or a president. It seems to undercut the professionalism of the responsibility, whereas a spokesperson has only one responsibility, and that is to speak for the president or the candidate. So I would think it is in that area that the responsibility ought to lie. Thank you. Ed Baumeister.
My name is Ed Baumeister. I'm a fellow at the Shorenstein-Barone Center. When I work full-time, I'm a newspaper editor, not a physician. Dr. Kassim reminded me of my first news professional encounter with a physician, the great Dr. John C. Ward, medical examiner of Worcester County, Massachusetts. And you would call Dr. Ward when someone had been found, and you say, Dr. Ward, what did he die of? And Dr. Ward would say, heart. What was wrong with the heart, Dr. Ward? Hole in it. What caused the hole, Dr. Ward? Bullet. This is only slightly enhanced for public distribution, but Dr. Kassim did hit upon something that I think underlies this, and maybe Tim Johnson bridges it some, is the distrust on the part of the medical profession of the press. You attached it to us getting money for delivering services. Hillary Clinton would like to discuss with you. You're receiving money for delivering services, but that's another thing. There is a question, and I think Tim Johnson represents an attempt on the part of the press to bridge it, to take what is very complicated information even for medical students and distribute it among the general public. And you didn't quite answer Marvin's question about how you would take this divulged information about a presidential candidate's health and distribute it. You distrust the press. How would you distribute it? And if you're forced to use the press, and I don't know who else there'd be, should you try to educate the press? Should you, what? How would you deal with it?
Well, I treat all my patients under an assumed name. Actually, Tim's series, ABC had a recent series about helping people understand what depression is like, and it went for 5 days, was an excellent program. And for instance, when the president falls ill, it's a tremendous opportunity for people to get more understanding about an illness and what goes into it. And perhaps because I think a person sitting in front of a television, they respond with their gut as to whether the person's a good person, worth voting for, do I like this person, does this sound honest, and so on. But all of the factors, for me, I'm the process that produced the guidelines there for the hospital, I think those are admirable experts, and I have had lengthy conversations with people from the media, actually. I do know them. And yet I remain terrified because actually one of the newspapers in town absolutely destroyed one of my woman psychiatrist colleagues in a way that I thought was outlandish, relentless, and she's not recovered from that. So I have a lot of reservations about what happens if I emit from my mouth some word about a person that's fine. If you want to filter it through a complex panel of multiple people who say, no, we have to get this across. How are we going to do it in a responsible way? Well, that's fine.
But my question is, if we do this, if we do learn more about the health of presidential candidates, if we agree that we will all try to get more information, doesn't it really invade your provinces?
Well, it does invade it, but now, of course, it's already in effect. There will be no candidates for president who will not know that their medical records are up for grabs. So it's a crapshoot on it, you know. So it's true. Everybody will be going after it as for any juicy tidbit that will be in it. So we know that that's a fact of our lives now, I think.
I agree with Dr. Kassim that the idea that at the moment of a presidential illness, there is also the opportunity for mass education in that particular illness. I think in theory I agree with that completely, but when President Reagan got sick, I thought that I was learning a little bit too much about his insides. It was really, I don't know whether you remember those pictures and designs and everything on television. Yes, please.
Thanks. I'm Chris Daly. I'm the New England correspondent for the Washington Post. And I was in the thick of this issue all last year in reporting about Paul Tsongas. And I came away from that process confused myself, really, about what to do. Quickly, here's what happened. In the fall of '91, my editors at the Washington Post decided it would be a good idea to talk to Paul Tsongas about his cancer. He was going to be a serious candidate, and it was going to come up. So I was designated to go talk to him and find out all there was to know about it. I'm not a doctor. I'm a general assignment reporter. And I went at it like any other kind of a story. I called them up and said, this is what I want to do, and I'd like to know everything there is to know. And he and his people thought about it, and they said, well, okay. And we realized, I think both sides realized where our interests were. I wanted a good story, a good, complete story, and they wanted to get this issue out. Hopefully, I think from their side, you know, in full, once and for all. So we went at it, and then I said right away, you know, as a reporter would do, I went fishing. I wanted the most I could get. I said, well, great, give me his medical records. And they said, oh, well, we don't want to do that. Some of them are handwritten, you probably wouldn't understand them, and Paul just doesn't want to do that. So I said, okay, well, what do we do instead? And they said, well, you can come interview Paul, you can interview his wife, you can interview the doctors, everybody's going to cooperate to the fullest extent. And I think everybody meant that. I think, you know, the intentions were quite sincere on all sides. And I interviewed his doctors and asked them all the questions that I could think of. Now, there's a very important problem. I don't know all the questions to ask. Especially, you know...
Was it your experience that information was volunteered when the subject, the source, understood that you didn't get the question?
Oh, yes. I found that as interview subjects, they were very forthcoming. There was nothing that I asked that they didn't answer to my satisfaction. As a layman, you know, and the question I kept coming back to over and over again with the doctors was, has he been cancer-free since the end of treatment? I must have asked that rephrased, you know, 10 different ways. And the answer always came back, yes. And then this led up to the interview I had with Senator Tsongas. He was busy being a candidate, but he made 2 hours available to sit down and talk to me about nothing else. But we did it over lunch. This was his decision. So we were interrupted by waitresses, by people stopping by his table to say hi. When I got home, I realized my tape recorder was next to his plate, and every once in a while his fork would ding his plate, and you know, I would lose a word or two here and there. It's a very imperfect process, and I can tell you. Again, we did the best we could. He was trying to establish a chronology over a long, rambling conversation. It was hard to do. At one point he brought up, he said, there was this thing in my armpit. Now this was what we later came to see as a relapse. But he brought it up in terms of a story he was telling about fear. And he told me the doctors disagreed about what it was, and it turned out not to be important, and he went on to other stuff. And his doctors never mentioned a relapse or a growth or anything. So I wrote a story saying he was cancer-free, and was only later that other people looking at the same information reached a different conclusion and decided that he had had a relapse, and that affected his prognosis. So what I came away thinking was I would want to know, I would want to have the whole medical record and have an expert help me to understand it.
Okay. Okay, well, Chris
That's what I want
Walsh
as a reporter.
is here with us, the Dana-Farber. And Professor Walsh, maybe you could, in a general sense, respond to this series of comments.
First, let me say, although the dean pointed out that 100 years ago they were steaming up the East River on these objects, I think as recently as a year ago, we felt at the Institute experience has proved to us we were in uncharted waters with regard to policies about the tension between that bedrock of privacy between the physician and patient and the public's need or interest or rights to know. I think in retrospect, you learn mostly from experience, and we felt the experience with Senator DeSantis and some miscommunication with the press was painful, a learning experience, and the leadership has taken some responsibility from it. I think what we have learned is that precisely the kinds of things we heard the panel talk about today, that when there is a medical record of a publicly prominent patient, that our institution, at least, has learned and has implemented the policy that we ask the patient whether he or she wishes to waive confidentiality. If they do, then we ask the treating physician to prepare a written summary to be reviewed by another physician who has no responsibility for the care of the patient. That summary, when written, will be provided to the patient, and he or she may review it, cannot edit or change it, can only tell us, yes, I still wish to waive my confidentiality. That is the statement that would be made available, and then we will appoint a spokesperson for the institution who is not one of the treating physicians, but who is generally knowledgeable in the area about the case to interact with the press. We feel we've learned by experience that this would be a very useful way to proceed. I think it has served us in good stead, most recently with Mr. Songus and other patients. And I think that that would be a reasonable way to proceed in the basis on which one might contribute to the dialogue around this issue.
Is this the guidelines that you're now talking about? Is this what you've got in your hands?
Yes,
I see.
and they would be available from
So
our Public Affairs Department. This was fashioned from our experience.
And
this is the direct result of
I would just add one element to that, if I may, that when that summary is presented to the patient has a right to say, I do not want it released, but then the institution must say, then we will make no comment about your case.
Mm-hmm. Correct. And I think those would be very useful guidelines, and we would be happy to have them debated by other institutions.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Walsh, and I think that our time is just about up, and I wanted to thank first our panelists, Sissel Labach and gentlemen, and all of you for coming tonight. A most interesting discussion. I hope that you got some of the answer to your question. And for all of you, thank you very much for coming. Good to see you.